describe to you a little bit about what I'm thinking today. And today is, as I said before, Parshat Va'era. And, when you read today's Torah reading, you wonder how much the Haggadah influenced the Torah. Well, it didn't. It was the other way around. And oh yeah, I also wanted to I told everybody at the beginning of the service today that today is the birthday of Sophia Kalish. I don't know how many of you know Sophia Kalish or remember her. She was born in 1886. Sophia Kalish. She became so famous and so popular. And she was considered the last of the red hot mamas. Nobody knew her name as Sophia Kalish. They all knew her as Sophie Tucker. Sophie Tucker was born today in 1886. I thought that was something I would like to share with my congregation because I'm sure you all knew Sophie Tucker. Anyway, each Pesach we're asked to remember that we are once slaves and strangers in Egypt. We have to remember that we were there. We were slaves and we were strangers in Egypt. We're further taught that no matter what has become of us as individuals, we should always remember our past. I've been saying lately, we're part of a 4,000-year-old family. And we are. I fully admit that there are very few of us who are living today who can easily relate to what it was like to live as slaves in Mitzrayim. I even think about sometimes as the years go by and I see my grandchildren, they don't know 9/11 the way we do. I don't know Pearl Harbor the way people who lived that time. How can you? And yet we're told that we have to think that we were slaves in Mitzrayim and that we were strangers in that strange land. Hard to do, but it's even more difficult for us to accept when we read the Torah, how a guy like Yosef, how could this guy, he was an egotist, he just walked around and bragged all the time to his brothers. They sold him into slavery. How could this guy rise to a position of such power that he had? The second most powerful person in the world at the time. How could that happen? Mitzrayim knew that he saved the population of the world at the time. Then how could they have turned completely against him and his ancestors after the new Pharaoh comes and oppressed them as they did? The Torah describes that it got so bad that God had to step in to free Bnei Israel. How did this happen? This new Pharaoh comes along and says, I don't remember this guy? Now, it wasn't that simple. Okay. We have recorded, credible history, works of history that are accepted by historians. The Torah isn't that. However, most of us would consider this as a mere Torah story, if not for historical backup. It's the same kind of way we view creation. Eating the fruit at Gan Eden, Cain killing Hevel, the Tower of Babel, the flood, and so many other things. Most people view these not as history, but as stories that are taught to teach us a lesson. But most people accept those stories not with any historical significance, but rather as a way to help us understand the human condition. They explain it. That is a lot different than how we view the rest of Tanakh, because in the Jewish Bible, because the lives and times of the kings and prophets are backed up by accepted history. They really did exist. We know that. Does anybody know for sure if Moses existed? I don't think so. We just accept it. It's a story that we want to know and that we learn from. And it's an important story because God gave us the Torah. So getting back to today's Torah reading, there is little historical validation to much of what is written in it. Does this mean that it never happened? Maybe, but not necessarily. In the case of what happened to Bnei Yisrael, there is evidence that it really did happen. And let me explain. Historians that study that time in history tell us that during the intermediate period, which is what that period was called, and that goes from 1786 to 1567, 1786 to 1567, before the Common Era, BCE, ancient Egypt was ruled by some people called Hysuks, Hyskos, Hysuks. These people were non-native Egyptians. They came there, they took over the country, and they ruled it. According to all accepted documented history, this ruling power consisted of a considerable number of descendants of guess who? If you said Bnei Yisrael, you win. What do you win? Well, you get to win the satisfaction that you alone know how smart you are and that you have been blessed with an amazing gift of intuition. Either way, mazel tov for winning the prize. But these Hysuks, they ruled Mitzrayim for about 200 years. Then which coincides with what we learned, because the Egyptians, we were there for 400 years, and for 200 of those years, we didn't have a problem in the first part, but then it became a problem. But the natives of Mitzrayim overthrew the Hysuks. They got rid of them, and the governance returned to the Egyptians. So it's fascinating how closely this independent and approved history supports our Torah's explanation as to what happened. The concluding chapters of the book of Bereshit, the first book of Torah we finished a couple of weeks ago, celebrate how Yosef's administration predicted, prepared for, and managed this great famine that came along. So let's listen to this. This is kind of an interesting thing. We're told of Paro's gratitude to Yosef. He absolutely loved Yosef for what he did, and how he openly expresses his appreciation by extending his hospitality to Yaakov and his family, Yosef's father Yaakov, and all his brothers, all their children, all his family, all of Bnei Israel. So we're also told that during that time, Bnei Israel grew into a massive population. Why not? They had everything they wanted, and it was an easy way to live. Then last week, we read about this Paro who rises to power and doesn't know Yosef at all. Just doesn't know Yosef. It doesn't say why, but there's a reason. There's no reason given, but the Torah tells us the Paro enslaved and tried to eliminate Bnei Israel by murdering all the males born to them. So from now on, from this day on, there'll be no more males born to the population. Therefore, it would only be the women. They'll have to intermarry with the Egyptians, and there won't be any more Bnei Israel. That was his logic. So this implies that a different governing power came to be that wants to eliminate its political foes. And sure enough, the history says that's true. So let us once again refer to the book of Bereshit, Genesis. When we see that Yosef forced the Egyptians to give their grain to the government during the years of plenty, Yosef piled up grain like the sand of the sea. As the famine took over the area, all the world came to Yosef and begged him for bread. But Yosef didn't give them bread. Yosef sold them back their own grain in the case of Egypt. He sold it back to them. So they gave it to Egypt, and now they got to buy it back. Sounds like taxes in the United States. Anyway, imagine how rich and powerful Paro and the Hysuks became as a result of what Yosef and Bnei Israel had done for them. Bnei Israel was given a special status. They were given their own land for nothing that was free. They got animals and crops to manage, no taxes. They weren't slaves. They did what they wanted with it. And while the rest of the population of Mitzrayim, they were pushed into being slaves for the government. Now, we read last week the Paro arose who did not know Yosef. This triangulates with the timing of when the Hyssachs were overthrown. It was obvious that the Egyptians who took their power back oppressed, enslaved, and humiliated the old government, of which many were us, were Bnei Israel. This also could explain why it was so easy for the new Paro to ignore what Yosef and Bnei Israel had done positively for them. Egypt had developed a deep-seated hatred and bigotry against Bnei Israel. I'm not just talking about the Egyptian government, I'm talking about the people. Look at those guys. Look what they got. This is wrong. Look at me. I'm slaving around. I'm a slave. I have to sweat. And they do whatever they want. They have everything they need. I think you'd be mad too. So looking at what we learn in the beginnings of the book of Shemot versus what we learn from history, it really puts things into perspectives. The facts are clear. Since our ancestors were once the oppressors in Egypt, they were the oppressors, and since they were paid back for their actions by becoming the oppressed, we should learn from this that we must live moral and ethical lives and never oppress others. You read about Israel and the Gaza, it's all backwards. We have learned that lesson. We don't oppress. But by always remembering that we were slaves in Mitzrayim, it makes us much more empathetic to the oppressed around the world. That's why we are told to remember we were slaves in Egypt. Maybe that is why so many American Jews actively support freedom and liberty. Actively support it. I know when Marilyn Gerstein reads the prayer for our country, she loves to read that prayer because she believes it so much. And she wants this country to be free and we should all have liberty. But so does everybody else here on the call, on this service. But I'm not sure how well known this is. But the first veterans organization in the United States of America, the very first veterans organization was the Jewish War Veterans. A lot of people don't know this. Why? People assumed that Jews would never join and fight for the country. The Jewish War Veterans was created to raise the visibility of the American Jewish soldier, who was very active in every war that we had. So by looking at how our ancestry existed as both the oppressor and the oppressed, it helps us understand the value of humility. We must never ignore our past, as we are a 4,000-year-old people, a family. Looking back at our past, we see that we always became strangers in the strange land wherever we were forced to live. That is why our Jewish people were given the state of Israel. We can never be strangers in our own homeland. That's impossible. But they're trying to make it that way. But that is why now is finally the time for all Jewish people. Every Jewish person, you and me, our children, our families, our friends, every Jewish person must do whatever we have to do to eliminate those who want to take our land away from us. Losing the state of Israel in these modern times would signal the end of us as a 4,000-year-old Jewish people. And I know that sounds like hyperbole. I know it. But let me explain why it's not. With the advanced communication technology available to everyone in the world, everyone, the anti-Semites can more easily care, feed, and grow their hatred toward Jews than ever before in history. Just want you to think this. God forbid Thank God it didn't happen. But imagine if Hitler, Yamach Shemo, his name should be erased, had the kind of technological tools like we have today. Facebook, TikTok, texting, YouTube, and the rest of our things, technology, communication tools. Imagine if they were in the hands of every German citizen of every age and spread through Europe during his satanic reign of terror. Imagine. Do you think you and I would be having these services every Shabbat? It's possible, but it's almost hard to believe. I mean, it's highly unlikely. We would have been done. What agreed upon history does not tell us is what our Torah teaches, and that is that our ancestors were enslaved for 400 years. We are taught that Bnei Yisrael only gained liberation through the strong and outstretched hand of God. Today's younger leaders do not believe it, they don't understand it, they don't accept it. They think that the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, is nothing but a series of myths similar to what the Greeks did. They published myths. So even if they're right, let's assume they are, just for the sake of this argument, although I don't think they are. The lessons of the Torah teach us about how Bnei Israel became so accepting of being slaves. That happens, it happens over time. People become slaves. Could happen here. It could be. It's happened in other countries. And then when they become slaves, they don't know any other way to live. They can't function as free people because they become dependent on what they have to do because they're told. So even if the Torah and the Tanakh is a myth, that God needed Bnei Israel to play a moral role in the future development of the world, what is so wrong with that? Why is that bad? What is so wrong if we learn that Bnei Israel stumbled through the desert like babies, always complaining about food and water? Sounds pretty normal to me. What is so wrong with seeing that freedom cannot and will never be free, and that we must work hard to achieve it and keep it? What's so wrong with thinking that way? If we don't think that way, we're going to lose freedom. So what is so wrong with learning that those who live as the oppressor will have to live with what will happen as a result? That is why I cannot believe the Tanakh is documented mythology. I cannot believe it. If we never learn what that great gift of our ancestors wants us to know, will we ever be able to count on the mercy of God to come and save us ever again? I fully admit that there are very few of us who are living today who can easily relate to what it was like to live as slaves in Mitzrayim. Even I have a hard time doing that. How do you do it? It may be even more difficult for us to accept how a guy like Yosef could rise to a position of such power. How could that be? It's a tough one. Anyway, as we were talking, we knew that Paro and Yosef were very close. We knew that. But we also knew both of them died. Generations went by. The government changed. It says so in history. So what are we going to do? We have to look at our ancestry and how it existed. As I said, we're 4,000 years old. That is why the Jewish people were given that state of Israel. We agreed upon history. What agreed upon history does not tell us is that we had ancestors that were enslaved. doesn't tell us that. Only the Torah tells us that. So it's hard to achieve anything based on a myth. It's really hard. How could we last 4,000 years if these were all myths? I don't know. I'm getting upset again. Anyway, let me calm down. So perhaps the Jews have found ourselves helping the oppressed. We're always the first one there. We're the first to volunteer, to raise money, to feed the poor. And if there's a disaster somewhere, even if it's in a country of our enemy, we're the first. We send in whatever, doctors, medical supplies, food. We send it in. We don't care that they're our enemy. We think they're human beings, because they are. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we read the story of our exodus from Mitzrayim in this context? In a short time, we'll be cleaning our homes for Pesach. And then sitting at a Seder in our Haggadah, and it says, my father was a slave in Mitzrayim. My father was a slaveholder in Mitzrayim. How do you be both? Monday is a day our country reserves to remember Dr. Martin Luther King. He should rest in peace. He was a truly great man. Many Jews don't know this, but he knew our Tanakh backwards and forwards. He knew it. You could quote from it from memory. He taught how important those words contained in those volumes were, and often quoted long sections of it. That is why so many learned rabbis befriended him. They could have really good discussions about Tanakh together. Dr. King was a remarkable man who connected like a hand in a glove with the Jewish people. He loved that Israel had been reborn as the homeland of our people. Dr. Martin Luther King was such a supporter of Israel. He spoke out against anti-Semitism anytime he could. Of course, he spoke out against any kind of bigotry, against his own people, but also against the Jew, specifically. The notion of Dr. King's dream was based on what I spoke about today. He based it on this Torah. He was such a remarkable human being. Is what people say about Dr. King a myth? How could it be? What Dr. King did is no more a myth than what is contained in our Tanakh. Dr. King would often quote Proverbs 3:18, and where it says, the Torah is a tree of life for those who hold fast to it, and those who uphold it are happy. Its ways are pleasant, and all its paths peaceful. Return us to you, God, so that we shall return. Renew our days as of old. He quoted that in many speeches. Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm not talking about Rabbi so-and-so. I'm talking about a Christian minister. So for those of us who know this, what he says, the words in Hebrew, I think we know as well. And if you do, please sing them with me. Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tamcha meyushar derachem ha darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva Kadesh Kadesh Yameinu Kadesh Yameinu Kekadem. In closing, I would like to say I proudly wore the Green Beret in service to our country. The motto, the reason I'm telling you this is because the motto of the Army Special Forces Green Beret is the oppressor libera, which means to free the oppressed. I proudly wore that, and I have it on one of my hats, the oppressor libera. I have a jacket that says that on the back. I didn't get it for today's Devar Torah. I've been wearing it for years. That motto sums up our Tanakh. It sums it up beautifully, and the life of Dr. Martin Luther King as well. May Dr. King's memory serve as a blessing to all of us, and may we fight to keep our Torah held high. And we should live as mentors for the rest of those who dwell on this earth. That's our role. We live as mentors. And let us all say, Amen. Before I say Shabbat Shalom, I want to remind everybody, tomorrow is day 100 of the war in Gaza. Day 100. Too many people have lost their lives because it's so important to be free. It's not free. Being free is not free. It costs a fortune in both dollars and money and also in human lives. And we wish them all a refuah shalema who are sick and a blessed memory for those who passed. And with that, I'll say Shabbat Shalom, Am Yisrael Chai, and the oppressor liber, to free the oppressed.